Behold, my glorious supporter YatogamiOdin has requested some discussion about stock elements in media, primarily in the context of high school anime and manga, and the Commedia dell'arte as two examples. Cool. Okay, YatogamiOdin continues. Japanese high schools are a common manga setting, and there are a handful of events that are practically guaranteed to show up given time. School festivals, holiday festivals, class trips, the beach episode, and so on. By my estimation, Yatogami elaborates, the use of these stock elements allows the writer to focus on the things that make their story different. Okay. That is, the audience can be assumed to know what's going on in the background, so more attention can be given to the character interactions. Commedia dell'arte took a different path to a similar destination. That form of theater, which has come up in Parley before, I've used it as an example in the past, instead focuses on stock characters with distinctive appearances. Audiences familiar with the Commedia can instantly identify the characters' personalities and relative standings on site, which allows them to focus on the scenario instead. Let's briefly elaborate on that point. So the idea of the Commedia dell'arte, if you're not familiar, is that it'd be like if a guy is wearing like a blue robe, you know that guy's like an elderly merchant, usually having come across misfortune, and that's kind of their stock character type. These type of things are used a lot in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, or in fantasy media in general. There's kind of this trope of the guy whose wagon of goods has just toppled over a little bit, and you know it's like, okay, we're gonna save the goods, and he's gonna give us a reward, and we're you know. And so you can focus more on like the environment often in MMOs, but yeah, in the Commedia dell'arte it was for the scenario, so that you can focus on what is happening in the story, because you kind of know what the character's shtick is. You don't have to meet all these people. You can just focus on like the plot. That's an interesting point that you made, that the Japanese high school thing is like the sort of plot of the characters' lives is eminently known, and it's really just like, how are those characters going through like the high school thing, you know, that experience. Whereas the Commedia dell'arte is sort of the opposite. We know the characters so that we can see how those characters that we're familiar with, or those types of people we're familiar with, go through this unique situation. Cool. Finishing up, Yatogami says, my previous parlay touched on the difference between derivative and transformative work, which I think is also relevant here. In a sense, this parlay might be considered a continuation of that discussion. What do you see as the virtues and shortcomings of the stock elements approach? Cool. I think the way that you described the benefits is really intelligent. That's a smart way to describe it. The idea that it, at best, it lets the writer focus on what makes their story special without focusing on the things that don't matter. If you don't mind me giving an example, in gaming, for example, a lot of stories and a lot of games kind of hand wave like your family or whatever, because they know that a lot of people playing these games, you know, you're playing the game to be you, not to have your normal life. And so things that are similar to your normal life, yeah, like that's probably a thing, but we can kind of just forget about that stuff for now and have fun doing this thing. And that, I would argue, does save a lot of time rather than having sort of a rote introductory sequence. There are times where I feel like getting those things done is interesting. You know, if you don't mind me using D&D again as an example, when you play Dungeons and Dragons, it's common for people to take both approaches, to let everybody meet each other organically and form an alliance on their own, or to just kind of assume everyone is together. Personally, I think if you have the right group, it can be very nice to have everybody, you know, sort of just show up in the same place and not be aligned with each other, maybe even be suspicious of each other, and then maybe come together in some way on their own terms, possibly leading, I think usually leading to really interesting character interactions later on. So the reason I bring up that example is to make the point that I don't think it's pointless to like do that legwork yourself, but I think for a lot of stories, it's just so decidedly not the focus that there is some merit to just saying, I'm just not going to do that. Now, so far, we've painted a really positive picture of how kind of using these stock elements to get things out of the way could be a good thing. Why this, lazy writer shortcut where we just take the exact same thing that people always see, how that could be a good thing. Because I agree with you. I think it can. There are some very well put ways that you've described where it could be beneficial. But I hope that my Dungeons and Dragons party example explains how it could also be a really good thing to do that legwork, to see the kid's childhood. I have a huge pet peeve with flashbacks. I think a lot of flashbacks are just pointless. There's just no point. We don't really need to know why, this person was the way they are. It's enough to sort of know that they have a motivation, that I believe that they're sufficiently motivated, that they hold a grudge or whatever. I don't really need to see like exactly why like their whole family was killed or something. Fine, they're doing that thing. That's an example of something that not only does it and here's something, not only is it something that we're familiar with, we know that trope. This is kind of about tropes a little bit too. But it's also something where the motivation that's being given, to take revenge or whatever, is inherently kind of shallow, and so the specifics truly don't matter very much, by the very nature of that thing. I would argue it simply inherently doesn't really matter why they're trying to do that thing, because they're kind of wrong to want to be doing that thing. And almost every story that uses that trope does go on to sort of, the character changes in some way. Not every story, but for a counterexample, in Doom 2016, you play as a guy who doesn't give a shit about anything. And do we know why he acts that way? No, because who cares? There is this element of that's just not the tone of the story. That's the whole point of the story, is that it doesn't matter why he's acting that way, because screw all these genre tropes. I just want to break the expensive space technology. Fine, it has its place. So my preliminary answer to your question is that, yeah, I mean, they just need to be deployed in the right situations. I think that pretty much any amount of stock trope use or lack thereof has at some point in history made sense in the right situation. And I feel like I am a little surprised to find that I'm able to easily produce examples of when this was done to varying pretty much any imaginable degree. Cool. So that's sort of a preliminary answer. I do think they can all be really good, but you want more specific virtues and shortcomings, and so do I. The thing that occurred to me as we were talking before is that there is something about there's a method to the madness of when is it meaningful to kind of see the legwork done, to go through the rote process of meeting what would be Commedia dell'arte stock characters, to go through the process of establishing this is how this school works or whatever. Besides just making it different. Obviously, if it's going to be something different than that stock thing, then that's one thing. But what I mean is, the party is still going to unite and go on adventures together. That's what we're going to do. We have to do it or we can't play D&D. So when is there still a point in letting everybody sort of align their things, right? And I think it depends on when the events of the story or the character's development are going to happen. I'll give you an example. In Persona 5, most of the characters don't have very interesting lives until when the story starts or right before the story starts. So it makes sense that we don't see them, we don't really see them go through childhood or whatever, because it's irrelevant. They had a sort of Commedia dell'arte stock, most of their life up until the story. And the story is about how the events that occur around them shape who they are. That's not the only thing it's about. I'm just saying that's sort of why it's focused that way. I think it fits to not focus on all that stuff. I think that Persona 5 does a pretty good job of not having annoying flashbacks because they wouldn't be relevant. You played through all the meaningful things that happened. Do you really need to be reminded? And they only do it once or twice when it's something you saw right at the beginning of the game with no context. That's pretty good. On the other hand, One Piece, a show I otherwise really enjoy, constantly flashes back to things because it's very long. You know, it's a really long story. But I find that deeply frustrating. I almost always skip through because I remember them. I don't need to see again that, you know, how Buggy and Luffy met. I know, I remember. I don't really care, you know. For a lot of these characters, they have, you know, pretty simple motivations. One Piece is a story in a lot of ways of exploration, and so I don't think it even matters that much why even characters with pretty specific backstory beats, like Trafalgar Law is an example. I don't really feel like we do need to know or see exactly what happened. I feel that time could have been trimmed, but One Piece has an incentive to not go too fast. And for what it's worth, One Piece, I'm not trying to take too much of a shot here. I think that given how long One Piece has been going for, combining all of the factors, I think the show does a pretty good job of compromising, keeping things moving while still like not going so fast as to be impractical. It could be faster, but many shows drag their feet much more, at least much more consistently. There are times where One Piece does that. But that's just an example. I'm trying to give a lot of examples, so hopefully people know some or can imagine. You know, there are stories where I just don't think it's about that. The focus is kind of on the now or moving forward, momentum, and how one event leads to another. The past events are kind of are the present events in One Piece, and so I just feel it isn't as necessary for us to see what they were. So yeah, I mean, I think a major negative of using these tropes is definitely that you potentially miss out on developing your characters in, you know, a way where you see a moment where they kind of became who they were. But I think it's quite easy as a writer to indulge your desire to like want people to know that and fail to notice that it really doesn't further this story. I'll give you an example for my own D&D campaign. I have a hag in my campaign that is, you know, hags can change what kind of hag they are. And this hag wants to, like some hags, has a motivation to be every kind of hag and eventually be the queen of the hags. A little joking reference to King of the Pirates from One Piece. But that's not enough for her. Hags can also cast a lot of magic if they're in a coven, 3 hags. 2 and then a third can break the tie between the 3 of them if 2 of them disagree. This hag also doesn't want to form a coven. She wants to be every hag and a few of them at the same time, and is sort of searching for the ability to get something like a clone or a simulacrum of herself, a homunculus or something of herself in some way to see if that will allow her to form a coven with herself. She, of course, doesn't know. I'll have to decide how that works. So that she can be the ultimate hag and her own hag coven, so there are no disagreements. Which, right, it's weird because thematically they get their magic from being in group of 3, they disagree and they whatever. But that stuff, like that thing I just started saying, like I think it's interesting how, you know, hags are in a coven of 3 and they have kind of like a social reason why, which, you know, I like to imagine maybe led to the adaptation or the flow of magic, allowing them to do powerful things when they're in that advantageous social formation, right? I think it's interesting if a character were to try to like break that, and I have like a magical reason that I've thought about why maybe it would or wouldn't work. But do the players care about that, or am I just indulging myself? Do you see what I'm trying to say? If I were to tell them, which I haven't and probably won't, unless they seek that information, in which case, sure. It may be advantageous to them. I mean, learning more about hags would likely be advantageous to them, but I don't know if they care about this hag's motivation. The same thing, like my big bad evil guy, my sort of one of, in some ways, the main villain of my campaign, at least the one I initially expect to be the main villain, is someone who made a contract with that hag and became a hexblood, but kind of betrayed them to some extent within the terms of that, and is running their own sort of shadow puppeteering a country from behind the scenes. They are meant to be an evil genius type of character. They're an armor artificer, sort of a evil fantasy Tony Stark looking character. But they have this complicated web of motivations, right? And the question I should be asking is, does it matter why this character is doing this to the players? And if not, what time should I try to save by, this became a writing advice parlay, by developing their motivations, but maybe I don't need to be extremely complete. Or, you know, as a dungeon master, should I really do all that work now, or should I wait to see if the players actually like this character, or, you know, will end up learning about their backstory. If that hag dies, for example, it's a lot less relevant where they gained the information that was the inciting incident for this campaign from their point of view. That just isn't as relevant because the person who gave them that information is dead. They're not going to go find them and have more interactions. They're not going to learn it from them. And I doubt he's going to tell them. So it probably doesn't matter as much. It's a good place to be, incidentally, if you're going to dungeon master a campaign for Dungeons and Dragons or a similar game, to make a lot of characters that you're excited to flesh out more, and then not flesh them out too much more. Wait to see if your players are interested in this or that character. You have such an abundance, they're going to be interested in one of them that you want to do more with. There's no need to worry that you're not going to get to flesh out characters. Have an abundance of characters you're interested in, and then wait to see who they're interested in and flesh out those characters. I do think there's an element, like we've been describing in this parlay so far, of min-maxing from a writer's perspective, where you put that design attention or flesh things out more. And that doesn't necessarily always have to come before you write this, publish the story, put it out there before people consume it. Yatogami, a kind of side branch of your question is the way in which modern anime and manga, at least in my experience, will adapt to what the audience has been liking in the show. There are a lot of shows I can think of. A really notable example is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, that added more of characters that the audience seemed to really like probably wrote in, I guess I don't know for sure, but it's very commonly believed that some characters showing up a little bit inexplicably in other parts of JoJo is because the audience likes them, took more of a liking to them. There's another really popular example that I'm having trouble thinking of right now, but of shows where very clearly the writer or the show writer, the publisher, hopefully all three, but probably the publisher, noticed that a character was more popular than maybe they anticipated and wrote more of them into the story, put more of them in than they had planned. They were a minor character, but the audience likes them. Does the writer not like the character they came up with? I don't know, they probably do. And so that character became a larger part of the story. This is also true in reverse. A really notable example in Genshin Impact, where Sangonomiya Kokomi got a much lower production value story quest because she was projected, and indeed did, make them less money. She was just less popular for a variety of reasons. I don't think a lot of them were actually her. A lot of them were the community saying toxic things about how she wouldn't be very good, which of course is always wrong. The community is always wrong, but that influences that. So I do think there's an element here of things not getting fleshed out more, which is similar to this sort of stock element thing, making the decision about what should and shouldn't be fleshed out based on what should be fleshed out, based on what people are interested in, rather than doing it at the beginning of the story based on what the story is interested in. I think those are two different things, but both important, and it can be useful to sort of start a story a certain way, but then kind of abandon if you think it's not really necessary to continue focusing on that part. I have even more examples. When I was in college, I wrote I almost said a light novel, a novella. I guess it is a light novel in a way, but a novella that a short book. It would maybe be a between 100 and 200 pages if it was printed. And the book had a gimmick or a mechanic in it that I took from Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World by Haruki Murakami, which I recommend taking a look at if what I'm about to say sounds interesting to you. It alternates like two stories, basically, chapter by chapter. So even chapters are my character was awake, and the odd chapters were them sleeping and having extremely vivid kind of stress dreams that represented something about what they were experiencing, which I depicted pretty thoroughly, in this dreamlike way. Why did I do this? Why does Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World do this? No spoilers for Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. I think that what Murakami is doing is taking this fantastical, more weird and abstract looking story and juxtaposing it directly, often, page and page of different stories before your eyes, to kind of modify each of the stories by association with the other. Let me put it another way. You eat something really salty and then eat something that is undersalted, but it tastes more salted because you have salt in your mouth. There isn't any more salt in the food, but because you had salt just a moment ago, or you had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and your throat is dry, so the milk tastes better. The milk isn't any better, but in the context of having had something dry, something wet is nice. And it's the same thing, I think. The part of the success, if you think it's successful, is that gimmick is allowing him, and hopefully me and my little story, to modify how reading about this person's everyday life feels, because you just read that kind of fantastical thing. Your brain is in this like slightly fantasy mode, and things just take on this slightly different quality when some creepy bog scene happens and they have a dream about something chasing them through a bog. And then in their mundane life, suddenly they're like in a bathroom stall at a movie theater alone with the door closed and a light is out. I think even most people in normal life wouldn't really find that creepy normally, but because you just read about something that was this kind of creepy atmosphere, your brain went into like horror mode, you know what I mean? So it is oddly creepy, even though nothing on the page is creepy. There isn't anything, even in the subtext of the way it's written, that is scary. It's just gained an additional quality kind of off the page. I hope I'm explaining that kind of well. I think, to go back to the core of the stock elements question, that is a good reason to start a story or like a D&D campaign or something and show the people kind of meeting up or uniting, or in a high school anime, what was their first day of class like? That, for a lot of stories, might not be meaningful, but it could be meaningful very indirectly, depending on what the rest of the story is, if there is some reason that it would set a tone. Maybe the class started out really tense and the teacher had to really put the nails on people, and it's kind of peaceful now, but knowing that happened before would be interesting, or not. It's possible that we don't want to know, so that there's this question about like, why is there this unease, in the environment? So again, I don't think that there's no simple answer to like, when should you, when shouldn't you? But I think there are merits and detriments. You can be revealing, telling, not showing, showing but very directly instead of showing indirectly, which is basically the same as telling, not showing, by adding in those initial details. And using stock elements can be mysterious if you do enough of the work to clarify that the audience isn't supposed to just assume that, this stock element is this way. I think this is kind of the final trick that I'll I'll discuss for this parlay. This thing about that certainly I don't, when I say trick, not to say I'm an expert on these at all, because I just thought of this, but that you need to telegraph to the audience some difference between this is meant to be a stock thing that you, audience member, wink wink, you know how this works. You can just forget about that part. We're just going to do a beach episode. There's a difference between that and saying, okay, audience member, so normally you're thinking like, oh, it's just the high school thing. We've got this high school thing, but we're signaling to you in some way, but not to the other characters, not really diegetically, not really in the world, that there is something about that that's meaningful that you'd have to kind of like look for. And I think this is usually pretty simple. You can simply have the characters wonder what something about that is. What was that tense thing? The transfer student wonders. That draws attention to it a little bit. The class could just be tense. Maybe the people are just mean or have a stick up their ass or something. Maybe that means we're not supposed to wonder like how it got this way. They just kind of are this way. But if one of the characters wonders like, I wonder how it got this way, then you are being told by the showrunner that it is of note why, because they could easily have just not pointed that out, and then you'd think like, this is just how it is, this is what we're doing. There are shows that make really aggressive use of this facet to sort of have there be genre trappings, and we're not really worried about what the practical consequences are, because we know that we're supposed to just assume like in this world that just works. A really good example of this, I think, is Way of the House Husband. Is that what it's called? I watched it a little while ago, which you should go take a look at. I think you'll very quickly understand what I mean. In this world, we're meant to understand that a Yakuza guy is inherently scary. He is scary. There's no need to, we don't have to justify why he's scary. Even if the animation is a little weird, okay, but he's scary though. That's what everyone's reaction is. And we're meant to understand that he is talking like a Yakuza person and treating everything like a Yakuza situation, even though he's actually just going to do house husband things. And in this world, that just works. He like obstructs the police to let a guy like do barbecue because the guy is like missing his home country. So he like makes the police not stop the guy from barbecuing. And it's like, okay, so he's like arrested now, right? We have to go to a plot point where he's just arrested. No, it works out somehow. Shut up. Like, you're meant to understand through the cadence of this show that's just the thing. Finally, to establish the point that a show can establish its own stock element. You could have a show, I think Way of the House Husband does this very clearly, that makes it clear that in this world, this is a stock thing that you just don't have to worry about. There aren't really consequences like this. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, sure, demonstrates a shocking lack of coordination from the police a lot of the time. They do these crazy things in a lot of these towns, and there just really aren't exactly repercussions. There are some plot points that attempt to deal with that a little, so you're not too distracted by it. The Speedwagon Foundation, there is a thing in the world that is designed to help people not get caught when doing this stuff. That's the summary. But you're mostly meant to understand that in this world, that just isn't really the focus. The characters are kind of superheroes in the way that in Dungeons and Dragons, people often play like, they are player characters with those stats, but they're like a little more in some way, and we're just sort of made to understand that, or that like they are somebody a little special. And when they do something crazy in a mundane situation, that's like the one person on earth who would have been able to do that. And that this is just why we're watching that person. I do think a show can kind of make its own stock element, which can be an effective way to communicate what your story wants to care about. Overall, I hope my waffling about this for a half hour was fun. The main takeaway, I think, besides my preliminary conclusion, that it can be good and bad depending on the story, is that it's all about communicating what your story wants to care about effectively. And I think that a lot of the time, mediating what you think is important versus what the audience would think is important, and thinking about how your story might be able to more effectively simply make its own stock element rather than taking one that already exists, might be better in some way. Overall, I do feel like there are stories that should be using like the optimal form of that story. I think this is a separate topic, but I have this whole obsession with this idea that there may or may not be, I really want to think through like a sort of a more perfect or optimal version of like a game or a story idea. And I think that without getting into that idea too much, there are stories where I think the sort of optimal way to tell that story is using these stock elements. But there are probably a lot of these stories where if you thought about it enough, there would be a way to kind of make your own stock element, and it would feel more immersive, like you're kind of in a world or a storytelling world, not literally in a world, but in a method of telling a story in a genre, I almost want to say, by creating your own sort of stock elements or genre conventions within your own story. But the writer fell back on using existing stock elements. I'll give you another example. I don't think that Persona 5's high school is like the same as K-on's high school. I don't think they're meant to feel the same. I don't think those high schools are meant to feel the same as a more similar one to Persona 5's, Sangatsu no Lion's high school. Sangatsu no Lion and Persona 5 do have remotely similar high school experiences depicted in them, I would argue. They have an amount of bullying that you can like sort of imagine is real, you know, like I think Persona 5 goes a bit far, but they're both like a bullying-ish. High school can be a rough place, but there are also like fun times or whatever, melancholic high school. But they're not meant to be the same because the rules of the storytelling world just are different. And I think that when you use a stock element, maybe the most concrete shortcoming is that you kind of telegraph that the rules of the story world are the same as, you know, other stock element instances of that, rather than just telegraphing that only that concrete element, the schooling system in Japan, is the same. You know, you kind of conflate the two, and you need to re-clarify that if you want. Finally, as a writer, it would be worth considering whether you actually save time in the story if you use this stock element, saving you the setup, but then you have to spend some time in the story clarifying that, like, but this world works differently, which maybe people would have just assumed if you just set up the situation to begin with. So there's that consideration as well. I hope this was fun. I thought it was really interesting. Yatogami, you did a lot of work here. I thought you just had a very complete point to begin with. So I hope you thought my waffling was an interesting addition.